This legend of street photography was passionate, obsessed, and potentially possessed by the art form. His addiction to the flow state he found himself in when taking photos led him to claim that it was as close as I can get to not existing. This state of mind drove him to shoot and develop an estimated 20,000 rolls of film throughout the course of his life, which became a problem for his social life, as his first wife claimed that being married to him was like being married to a lens, and his second wife berated him over his lack of control in financial regards as a result of his addiction to film, which upon his death caused him to leave behind 35,000 prints, 2,500 undeveloped rolls of film, 45,000 color transparencies, and 22,000 contact sheets, which equates to roughly 800,000 photos in total. He has been described as the central photographer of his generation, one of the greatest documentary photographers of his era, and as one of the people who defined street photography. This is Street Smarts Volume 17, Garry Winogrand. Winogrand was born in 1928 in New York. He had an interest in art from an early age and would go on to study it in college. After spending 2 years in the Army, he attended City College in New York, followed by Columbia, where he studied painting. It was at this time that his love for photography began to take shape. First, through the school's newspaper, where he would be introduced to a 24-hour darkroom and helped to form a club called Midnight to Dawn, named after the hours the group would spend developing and printing film. In 1949, he took a photojournalism class taught by Professor Alexei Brodovich, which would have a fundamental impact on Winogrand's photographic process, because it placed an emphasis on spontaneity and sincerity, opposed to the rigid studio photography Winogrand had been exposed to prior. In the early part of his career during the 1950s, he had photos in Sports Illustrated, Life, and Look magazine, as well as other popular publications of the time. A photo he had taken of a beach scene appeared in one of MoMA's traveling exhibitions in 1955 that was attended by over 9 million people. In the 1960s, he would begin to have some renown for his street photography work, with his inclusion in the MoMA exhibition 5 Unrelated Photographers in 1963. He would go on to take part in several other exhibitions, publish 4 books, and become a teacher of photography at several universities around the United States, spreading his influence, making a name for himself as a photographer that would go down in the history of street photography, largely because of how he was able to document candid moments in the lives of Americans. A series of standout projects that Winogrand created or took part in defined his legacy and the majority of his body of work as we know it. 1967's New Documents, which is considered an incredibly influential exhibition in regard to changing street photography, involved not only Winogrand, but also included photos from Diane Arbus and Lee Freelander. This exhibit put on display how street photography was changing through the work of up-and-coming New York City street photographers, including this young group. According to John Żarkowski, who curated the event, this group was markedly different from photographers of the 1930s and 40s because, in the past decade, this new generation of photographers has redirected the technique and aesthetic of documentary photography to more personal ends. Their aim has been not to reform life, but to know it, not to persuade, but to understand. The world, in spite of its terrors, is approached as the ultimate source of wonder and fascination, no less precious for being irrational and incoherent. Prior to this exhibition, there was very little photography, if any, to be found in museums. The diverse work of these 3 photographers was well received and highlighted the variety that could be found in street photography. Photography was not regularly found in museums because it was assumed to be easier than other art forms that museums traditionally focused on. The form found in the photos of this exhibit also highlighted the fact that not everyone could craft photos as powerful, and the idea of taking photography more seriously as an art form needed to be reconsidered. The Animals was a book released in 1969, displaying photos taken during the early 1960s at Central Park Zoo and the aquarium at Coney Island. The photos included in this piece are intended to draw parallels between the ways humans and animals act. The photograph's depiction of captivity can be read as a metaphor for the pervasive racial and gender segregation of the era, while also serving as an examination of public recreation and voyeurism. Certain photos beg the viewer to ask who is really captive in the situation, depending on the composition and framing of those shots. Public Relations is a project that was released in 1977, but originally worked on in 1969. Winogrand was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to put this project together, and it was meant to show the effect of media on events. All of the events shown in the project took place in the public and were as much for the benefit of the media that recorded them as for the direct pleasure or ritual relief of those participating. It is intended to show how people react in those types of situations, which included marches, rallies, press conferences, games, strikes, demonstrations, funerals, parades, award ceremonies, dinners, museum openings, victory celebrations, a birthday party, and one moonshot. In 1975, the most controversial of his projects was released, titled Women Are Beautiful. The photos of this project were taken at the height of second-wave feminism. So many of the women included in this project have a nature that is more free and rebellious than it might have been if the photos were captured earlier in American history. The controversy around this collection of photos is that some critics claim Winogrand was sexist and misogynist for focusing on photographing women so regularly in this manner, but a substantial amount of people differ in that opinion. According to art historian Zapinski Myers, rather than excusing Women Are Beautiful as a misguided or tone-deaf project, sweeping it under the rug like a dirty secret, in their considered installation and thoughtful writing about the photographs, the curators approach this body of work with critical and complex readings that inherently advocate equal respect for Women Are Beautiful, as is warranted by Winogrand's other projects. After almost 40 years, Laxton and other curators seem to be asserting that we should be able to look critically at these pictures without dismissing them. A basic reading of these images might lead one to the sexist, misogynist outlook, but the point of street photography, more than creating art, is to encapsulate history of a time and place. Women Are Beautiful does that by showing the counterculture of women in America at the time, and the styles, attitudes, and activities that went along with that period of American history. You see something happening, and you bang away at it. Either you get what you saw, or you get something else. And whichever is better, you print. To produce the amount of work that he did, Winogrand would take photos all day, every day, with a Leica and a wide-angle lens. He looked to make work that was inspired by Walker Evans' book, American Photographs, and Robert Frank's book, The Americans, but went about creating photos in his own unique fashion. While many street photographers consider their stealthiness a valued aspect of their technique, Winogrand disregarded that altogether by creating frames that make it abundantly clear that he is in the scene and part of the scene. The way many of his frames look make the viewer consider the way the photographer was involved in the making of that photograph. Winogrand's way of constantly fidgeting with his camera and making it look like he has no idea what he's doing appear to be how he was able to get such close proximity without much confrontation. His photos were able to contain a large amount of visual information for the viewer to interact with because of the wide-angle lenses he used, varying between 21, 28, and 35mm, but mostly relying on 28mm. He would typically shoot frames in quick succession without taking the time to create heavily considered compositions. The result of this being tilted and oddly composed frames that give his photos a unique quality. His rapid shooting, combined with his desire to shoot more than he developed and edited his photos, is what resulted in so many frames being left behind when he passed. Garry Winogrand died on March 19, 1984, at the age of 56, just 6 weeks after being diagnosed with cancer. Upon his death, he left behind 6,500 undeveloped rolls of film. However, these photos have since been curated to give them new life. While some might consider it intrusive to continue to develop and release Winogrand's photos after his passing, the main man behind it, Leo Rubinstein, pushes back on the idea by saying that the unfinished work was unfinished, because Winogrand died not only young, but suddenly, and he had no time to prepare anything for posterity. There are many reasons why he didn't edit and print more of his work, and they're all interesting. But would those pictures be better left unseen? We're speaking of one of the finest photographers there's been, and of work that changes the way we understand him. It's work of great beauty and depth that will nourish anyone who lets it in. So no, I think it would be arbitrary, rigid, and short-sighted to hide it away. In 1988, the first major retrospective of Winogrand's work took place. Jarkowski, who set up Winogrand's earlier exhibition at MoMA, believed that Winogrand's later work did not live up to what had been produced earlier, and only ever showed a small sample of it. To protest this, Leo Rubinstein included 164 photos from Winogrand's later work out of the 104 places included in the retrospective, because he believed that Winogrand was not washed up in the years I had known him. Although Garry Winogrand's color photographs have become exceedingly popular after his death and the release, there isn't much evidence that the photographer truly explored color photography during his lifetime. The only example of his color photos being put on display was during the 1967 New Documents exhibition. But this was only a few slides. Most of these slides melted in the projector that was showing them as a result of a technical malfunction. This is said to have pushed Winogrand away from using slide film and motivated him to use color film less and less throughout the course of his career. The book released after his death, Winogrand Color, includes only a small fraction of the 45,000 color frames he left behind. These photos are beautiful and really force the viewer to contemplate the impact Winogrand could have had on the world of color street photography if he had leaned into the medium instead of veering away from it. Since the slides that were presented during the New Documents exhibition were presented nearly a decade before the work of William Eggleston, a man who's seen as the pioneer of color photography. Winogrand's work that continues to be released after his death leaves a lot of room to consider what could have been for the artist had he been given more time on the planet he loved to explore with his camera. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep developing.